Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, before we formally begin, once again, it is time for the trigger warning. I am required by infinite inning policy to let you know that there is a brief mention of self-harm coming up. It's not the focus of the episode, nor even the story, but I thought I would let you know just in case. It's coming right up in about 2 minutes, I would say. So put earmuffs on the dog, the cockatoo, your house penguin. You don't have a house penguin? Everybody has a house penguin nowadays. Don't let me be the source of thoughts you find troubling. Thank you so much, the management. And now, we begin. We begin with the game of tennis. I can't play it, and I don't follow it as much as I once did because they play the big tournaments early in the day and I'm a night person. I guess I'm thinking primarily of Wimbledon. I was once, in one of my first writing jobs, asked to sit in on an interview with Steffi Graf. That was fun, and that was also that. I've never had ill thoughts of tennis, except when some devil spawn of a phys ed teacher required me to pretend to play it. But I guess in baseball, at least early on, people did. In 1927, the New York Giants picked up a California lad named Fay Wesley Thomas, a right-handed pitcher. In 1926, he had gone 16-5 with a 4.22 ERA in a season split between Toledo, where he pitched for a young manager named Casey Stengel, and New Haven. Legend has it that Thomas reported to camp in tennis whites, carrying his racket, and asking, "Which way to the court?" John McGraw heard that and wrote the guy off, if not forever, then at least in his own mind. Thomas was sent down to Buffalo out of spring training, though he got a 9-game trial in the bullpen that June. In August, Commissioner Landis declared him ineligible and suspended him for the rest of the season due to his pitching professionally 4 years earlier as Peter Collins, while trying to maintain his eligibility at USC. Wahoo Sam Crawford, at that time doing a bit of scouting, signed him for the Giants, and he and Peter Collins / Fay Thomas split the $5,000 bonus. Maybe Wahoo Sam knew about that bit of contractual chicanery, and maybe he didn't. As for Thomas, he next surfaced in Cleveland in 1931. A few years later, he pitched for Rogers Hornsby with the Browns. I imagine Hornsby thought even less of tennis players than John McGraw did. Thomas was only 23 after that failed trial with the Giants. He went back to the minors, eventually made his way to the Pacific Coast League, and pitched there for another 15 years, which was not a bad gig if you could get it back then. He won 214 games in the minors. His standout season was 1934, when he went 28-4 with a 2.59 ERA for the Los Angeles Angels. I don't know if he ever got his backhand perfected. In terms of the majors, I don't know which did his career more damage, the contract shenanigans or the tennis. I'm choosing to believe it was the tennis because people are petty that way, especially John McGraw. In what is an odd and probably unrelated postscript, Thomas took his own life in 1990 when he was 86 years old. That probably wasn't due to the tennis either, but merely the erosion inflicted by time in that cruel river we call the infinite inning. And welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 381 in an ongoing series. I remain your ongoing host for as long as I can manage it. Stephen Goldman, my friends call me, or Steve, and since I count you all among my friends, I assume that's what you call me too, as opposed to whatever your kids call me when you put this podcast on in the car and they're stuck in the back seat. Of course, it's different now than when I was a kid, at least initially. I guess most of your kids probably vanish into whatever is streaming to their headphones, and maybe there's nothing wrong with that. I don't know. We started to get like quality stereo headphones, I think about when I was 12 years old, something like that. And sure, at that point, I picked up a Walkman and listened to whatever I wanted to listen to. Before that, though, I was stuck with whatever dad played. And often that was a good deal. My father had good taste in things, and I liked being a participant in the family and having that to share the same way we would have if we had gone to the movies together or were watching a TV show together or just having a conversation. That said, as you get to be a teenager in life, you start to want to diverge from your parents and develop your own interests, and having a quality set of headphones became part of that. I hope this installment of the show finds you well. I hope you're doing better than Carlos Mendoza, Mets ex-manager, as of the day that I am recording this and the day that it goes out, more or less. The team was both losing and lately looked extremely sloppy doing it, and that will always get the skipper. Now that said, even McGraw, tennis prejudice or not, couldn't have done anything with this team. It was poorly designed. As I've remarked at other times on the show earlier in the season, the Mets weren't wrong to forego offering a long-term contract to Pete Alonso, or getting out from deals like those for Jeff McNeil and Brandon Nimmo. And as fun as Edwin Diaz could be when healthy, given the history of most 32-year-old relievers, even closers, they were wise not to compete with the Dodgers for his services. That said, you can't half-ass the replacements, and that's what they did. The owner did. The general manager did. Not primarily, we assume, Mendoza. No, don't sign me any good players. I'll go with what's on hand. This dog's breakfast, Juan Soto, and understudies. We have a lot to cover today, so let me move on quickly to the bulletin board section. This week at Baseball Prospectus, I wrote a bit about the owner's proposal to limit the draft to players age 20 and up, an existential threat to the game. I think it's dead on arrival, but I still really hate it. It was bugging me. I wrote sort of a conjury, so there are a bunch of other things in there. I wrote a bit actually about John McGraw's first wife and her very ugly passing, some things about Ryan McMahon getting a throat infection, and the different ways that players used to cough and sputter and die at a time when Americans were less educated about germs and had fewer defenses against them, and a couple of other things. 3 more players were added to the Dead Player of the Day series over at Patreon this week. We're up to about player 90. Those 3 were lefty Sam Zoldak, one of the least likely pitchers of the modern era to whiff anyone, in spite of which I kind of like him. A half-decent 1920s Phillies super sub of a kind, Russ Wrightstone, the only Wrightstone I believe in Major League history. Maybe we've had the odd wrong stone. And finally, Orioles 1980s second baseman Rich Dower. Dower, being the Friday entry, is free to any who would like to dial him up and read him, and it's uncomfortable for me. I remarked upon this briefly in the post, but it's always strange for me when a player who passed recently, whom I saw play, shows up in this series. It's like the song Enjoy Yourself, It's Later Than You Think. Like, these people who are part of the tapestry of your life seem to be wagging a finger at you in the way that some of the Titanic era players I often end up talking about don't. They really are ghosts. Dower, who passed just last year, is more of a cautionary tale. The caution being life. Be careful because you won't escape it alive. That said, Dower's post is not that, pardon the expression, dour. It's actually interesting because he made a conscious choice not to be the kind of hitter in the majors that he apparently was in college. And I found some rather scathing things that people said about him because he made that decision. I think he was probably right, but the problem in this case is being right didn't leave him very much in the way of production. And so he was also wrong. It's kind of a paradox. Must do what I can't do. Must do what I can't do. I don't think you can criticize a fella for that. Definitionally, he can't. But please, as always, read it. Let me know what you think if you have a comment. I always enjoy any comment, really, but the Patreon ones are especially rewarding. Doesn't Zoldak, as in Sam Zoldak, sound like a Space Ghost villain? Here's one thing I don't know. Space Ghost was designed, I believe, by the great comic book artist Alex. Well, here's the problem. This is how some of you make good-natured fun of me for mispronouncing names that I've only read, not heard pronounced, because the fella in question has been dead for 150 years. Why'd you call him Pete Browning when everybody knows it was Pete Browning? That's for purposes of hyperbole. I did call him Pete Browning. There's no reason to think that he was Pete Browning, but who the heck knows? So the artist I was about to refer to, I've read his name 1,000 times. I've seen his work 1,000 times, but I've never heard it pronounced. It was spelled Toth. I think of him as Alex Toth, but maybe it was Toth. Who knows? It's a mystery, just like Space Ghost himself. Why did he sound identical to the announcer from Laugh-In? No one has ever explained that. But worry ye not, because there are more explanations, or at least more storytelling, forthcoming on the program right after the break that is barreling down on us. As always, I began wanting to tell a fairly pure baseball story about one famous catcher, Yogi Berra. I believe that's how they pronounced his name, Yogi Berra. That's correct, isn't it? The Yoo-hoo salesman? Sorry, I'm hilarious, I know. Given some things I found while researching it and the press of current events, it kind of took off on me in the telling. There is still a lot of Yogi Berra in this tale of Yogi Berra, but there are a lot of other things as well, and I very much hope you will enjoy it. We will get to it right after this, yes, this brief intermission. You know, Yogi Berra would have been 100 last year. Did anyone say anything about it? I'm sure they did, but it didn't get onto my radar. If the Field of Dreams process, by which you could watch ghosts play baseball, was a real thing, he'd be high on my list of guys. Well, here's the thing. I wouldn't just watch these departed greats play. I would tell the players' families and have them stand by so they could have one more moment with those players. Then I'd watch them play. But why should Ray get to hog all of that sentimental family stuff for just him and his dad? Yogi's kids and grandkids are still here, so why wouldn't you share with them? Can I share something with you right now? I suddenly have the hiccups. How are you supposed to podcast when you have the hiccups? No one tells you this at the Daisy Hill Podcasting Academy. I suppose I'll just have to persevere as best I can and do a lot of editing later, because who wants to listen to that? Your bored kids in the back, maybe, if you can get them out of the headphones. But I would want to watch Yogi play. He was unusual, obviously. He was a 5'7" contact-oriented power hitter. He was, famously, from the moment he came up, habitually referred to as a bad ball hitter. You could go into any newspaper archive and do a search on bad ball hitter in Yogi Berra and get 100,000 hits. He made that work somehow. Now, physically and in terms of the style of hitting, he doesn't remind me of Vlad Guerrero the First at all, but the approach seems similar. Can you picture Guerrero swinging at balls that bounced in the dirt and getting hits? His conception of the strike zone was best expressed in hemispheres. If the pitch was located between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, he would swing at it, or at least permit himself to. And as you no doubt remember, he was able to hit .330 while doing that. Teams pitched around him so much that he even drew a decent number of walks. And so did Yogi, same reason. Hal Newhouser, the Tigers left-hander, had a great line about this, circa 1947, when Yogi was just starting out. Someone said of the then rookie-ish Yogi, he came up in 46, started playing regularly in 1947, he's a bad ball hitter. You shouldn't have a problem with him. And Newhouser, who had clearly seen him, said, yeah, he's a bad ball hitter, but there's no way to throw him a good pitch. That sounds a bit paradoxical, but if you think about it, it makes sense. Say you pitch Yogi high and outside or low and away, he could hit those pitches. But you can't throw it in the strike zone either because he's going to cream that. So your best hope, since as I said, he was also very difficult to strike out, was just to put it somewhere that seems good and hope that he made weak contact. Earlier this week, young Dodgers catcher Dalton Rushing got into a minor tiff with Shohei Ohtani, who was pitching. Rushing is playing a lot because Will Smith, normally the starter, is hurt. He and Ohtani couldn't get together on pitch selection, and Shohei had an uncharacteristically rough inning. Rushing, it seems, wasn't sufficiently deferential. And that sounds like I'm implying that Shohei Ohtani, annual National League Most Valuable Player, expects special treatment, but it's not that. Rather, that all pitchers, particularly veterans, expect to be listened to and not to be forced into throwing pitches that they're not confident about, given the situation or what's working for them on any given day. Rushing, who's played all of 100 major league games, doesn't have the gravitas to say, no, my way is better. I know what I'm talking about. After the game, Rushing took the blame for everything and talked about how the coaches and managers had picked him up. Manager, singular, that is. This isn't the 60s. This isn't the Cubs with the College of Coaches. And he also said, and this was a bit disturbing, that he's a grown man and it's embarrassing that he needed that sort of support. I hope one day he learns that there's no shame in letting people correct you when you're in the wrong. Who was it who said that it's not that one falls down, it's how you get up after you fall? That's almost a cliche at this point, right? If that requires others helping you up, so be it. The point is that you did get up. You learned a lesson about stumbling, and though you are definitely going to fall again because we all screw up, maybe you won't fall for the same reasons. And remember, there are different categories of friends. There are friends of the heart and friends of the road. Friends of the road are the people you sometimes have coffee with because you work together, but once you change jobs, you're never going to see them again. Friends of the heart are the people who are really there for you. And whereas it's great if you go to the movies together or have a Super Bowl party that they can come to or have a bi-weekly brunch, it's in the crises of your life that you find out what really matters about friends and what they can really do for you. And no, we shouldn't make a daily habit out of crying on their shoulders, but a couple of times a year, that may be okay. Again, I hope you don't have that many opportunities for weeping, but again, the movies, you can really do that solo. You can't talk to people during the movies, or at least you shouldn't. I realize that ship sailed a long time ago. I'll give you an example. When I was first diagnosed with ocular cancer and spent a week in the hospital being irradiated, some people I considered my good friends came to see me and certain ones didn't. And I remember to this day which were which. It seemed to me that Rushing was very upset over what is a rite of passage for young catchers. Every kid backstop hears that the veterans don't like the way he calls pitches, don't like the way that he receives them, and don't want to throw to him. They want to throw to Brad Osmus or Austin Hedges. And that was true of Yogi Berra, who also had trouble throwing when he first came up. Then he called too many fastballs to compensate, or so the pitcher said, and opposition base runners went wild anyway. Now, that last part was blown out of proportion. In 1947, Yogi's first full season, runners attempted 29 stolen bases against him in about 50 games that he caught. He threw out 10 of those runners. That was below average by 3 stolen bases. Then the Yankees played the Dodgers in the World Series that year, and the Dodgers played an aggressive running game. Yogi caught 3 of the first 4 games, and the Dodgers were successful in 5 of 6 attempts. Suddenly, Yogi was an outfielder. The throwing had gotten into his head and had gotten into manager Bucky Harris's head as well. Now, we've talked about Bucky Harris's management in the 47 series quite a bit on the show, or at least in a prior episode segment, so I'm not going to go into that in huge detail, except to say that this saga lasted into 1948, with Harris basically wanting to turn Yogi into an outfielder instead of a catcher. And that was part of the reason that Harris was fired after the season, because Yankees management, or the front office, I should say, felt very strongly that Yogi had great potential to be developed as a catcher, and with a little help from Bill Dickey, that turned out to be true. So I was going to give you some quotes from those involved about all that and from some of the Yogi biographies, but quite frankly, it was boring. There really isn't that much that was said about it, except that it happened. And it was addressed, and then his career developed on, and he wound up being the incredibly famous, successful player that we're all familiar with. Now, if it hadn't happened, that would have been different, and certainly there were some promising hitters who just couldn't catch and couldn't play anywhere else, and their careers were derailed. Or like Mackie Sasser, couldn't throw the ball back to the pitcher, and yeah, he could hit a bit, but he also visibly frustrated everyone involved, and so that was kind of that. But even Yogi couldn't talk about this in a really interesting way, since that fortunately didn't happen. He addressed it in his various As Told To memoirs, but while Yogi was a lot of good things, he was not a raconteur, he was not a good storyteller, and he didn't give his various ghosts much to work with. In his book, Yogi, It Ain't Over, he said, "You know, sometimes the TV announcers say the runner stole on the pitcher. They didn't say it this time. I am not going to blame World Series jitters. I'm not going to do more than say I wasn't good. I don't know what was on Bucky's mind. It would never cross my mind to ask. Maybe he was told by the owners to take me out, but I doubt it." My friends, if you are ever called upon to write your memoirs, do not be withholding. Either say how you really feel or felt, give vent to what you experienced, or don't write the book, no matter how much. Okay, I realize I would give in at that point too. Millions of dollars to write your memoir, fine. But I would tell you how I felt. I really would. Don't I do that every show? So I gave all of that up as a bad job, but not before I came across an anecdote, not from 1947, but from early in the 1954 season. The Army McCarthy hearings were going on in Washington, in the Senate. For years, McCarthy had functionally ruled the country by terrorizing a certain segment of Americans with accusations that they were disloyal. If you were a communist, whether you were actually a direct pawn of the Russians or just doing it because you believed in that philosophy, you were an enemy to the United States of America. Free speech rights be damned. Free thought rights be damned. Now, Senator McCarthy was a Republican, and when he started out with this routine, I have here a list of X number, he changed the number all the time, of card-carrying members of the Communist Party who are currently at work in the State Department. He was attacking the Democratic Truman administration. But by 1954, Ike was the president, Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican. So he was attacking his own party's members. Worse, he had been dragged seemingly by his fixer, Roy Cohn, into attacking an institution that Eisenhower cared about very much, the United States Army, saying that there had been infiltration of commies into the U.S. Army. And well, the Army said, hell no. And further, when he wouldn't drop it, said, you know what this is really about? McCarthy and Cohn sought favorable treatment for one of Cohn's friends, one G. David Shine, who had been working with them on their anti-communist crusade and was a recent draftee. He had been assigned to Fort Monmouth in New Jersey. Cohn wanted him freed from all that basic training nonsense and sent back to Washington. When the Army said no, suddenly there were communists at Fort Monmouth, or so Cohn threatened. McCarthy, and I will explain this more in a moment, fired back with a series of so-called transcripts revealing that no, it was the Army trying to silence him and Cohn. They were protecting those commie rats. And it was decided, I'm not sure who decided it, so forgive the passive voice, that there would be a sort of trial in the Senate in which these conflicting accusations between the Army and McCarthy would be aired. And this was played on It was broadcast on national TV. Millions of people watched it, some because they believed in McCarthy's efforts, even though they were mostly fictional, some because they were hoping he would be brought down, some because it really did seem like the fate of the government was at stake here. This so drew the nation's attention that in the dugout, prior to one Yankees game, the beat writers and the manager, who happened to be Casey Stengel, found themselves discussing that instead of the game. Stick to sports. Who do you think you're talking to anyway? And the great thing about it is that Casey, who loved talking about Yogi, loved to find reasons to praise him, brought the discussion back around to the catcher. And I'll tell you how that all went down right after this short break. I probably don't need to say this, but it was during the Army McCarthy hearings that those of you who like to listen to old REM songs, you'll know this one. It was during that the Army's counsel, Joseph Welch, said to McCarthy, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you no sense of decency?" The answer had always been no, but somehow the moment was credited with helping to break the grip McCarthy had on the country. Everybody applauded when that moment went down. And the reason, as you probably know, is that in digging up dirt on the people who would be cross-examining him during these hearings, Cohn found, or somebody involved with McCarthy's staff, that there was one young lawyer who was associated with Welch's firm who had in the past made the mistake of belonging to some left-wing lawyers group that was later determined to be a communist front organization. And Welch said, well, okay, he made a mistake when he was young. That's in the past. I'm not going to bring him to Washington. You don't mention him. Deal? And they agreed. But then when McCarthy felt cornered like a rat, he reneged and tried to assassinate this lawyer, this kid, on national television, and that brought on the rebuke from Welch. You know, just today, our current president, who was an acolyte of Roy Cohn's, gave a speech to some group where he said that the greatest threat against the country is the cancer of communism. He's like an oldies tour, and I wonder who that plays to in 2026. I was working on this episode at the same time that he said that, and I had to stop for a minute and figure out if I was still reading something about Joe McCarthy or I was looking at today's news. And you can understand, if you do go back to the history of American Red Scares, why this sort of tactic started working about 1919 or 1920, and it did again after World War II. But now, it doesn't seem like it would have a natural constituency, except among the ultra-paranoids, which is where it started way back when. So as I said before the break, this was national news on everyone's mind in the spring of 1954, and some game found the beat writers, I'm not sure which one, discussing it with Casey Stengel in the Yankees dugout. Maybe they were waiting out a rain delay. I don't know. I actually suspect it was during spring training, when everything is more relaxed and there's more time for discursive conversation. In mid-March, the Army had released the report that I mentioned, detailing all the ways that Cohn had tried to get favorable treatment from the government for his draftee pal, and they detailed something like 50 contacts between Cohn and the Army, and that when he didn't get as much cooperation as he wanted, that he threatened them. McCarthy then responded with 11 so-called memoranda, descriptions of conversations that were had between Cohn and the Army that showed him in a more favorable light. They seemed to suggest that the Secretary of the Army at the time and one of the Army's lead lawyers were trying to blackmail, that was the word that McCarthy used, the senator and his henchmen into dropping this investigation because it would make them look bad, the discovery of commies under the rug in the Army. These memoranda, which seem to have been referred to interchangeably as transcripts, now these hearings ran for like 6 weeks, so maybe I'm missing a different incident, but I think that this is what is meant by transcripts, were fraudulent or at least very misleadingly edited. And as I said earlier, the hearings were meant to be a kind of playoff to decide which version was going to be the accepted one. Who was the bad guy in this situation? And the whole country was talking about it, and it came up before a game in the Yankees dugout. According to one writer's account, some writers were discussing the matter of transcripts with Stengel. The transcripts were then a big issue in the hearings. These transcripts, Casey was saying, what are they? Just records of what was said at meetings? That's right, someone said. Hell, we don't need no transcripts on this club, Stengel said. We've got Berra. When you got him, you got a record of everything that's been going on anyway. That was meant as an encomium to Berra's great memory, one of the ways that he was so effective at calling pitches, because he remembered everything that everyone had ever swung at or not swung at. But what struck me most powerfully was, again, that neither the Yankees nor the writers were sticking to sports. They were discussing right there in the sacred dugout where Babe Ruth spit sunflower shells, the most important political matter of the day. And yet, even tail gunner Joe McCarthy and his nonsense could be brought back around to be about baseball, because baseball is everything and everything is baseball. And ultimately, what is more fun to think about? Political demagoguery, or this little guy who catches for you and wins the MVP award 3 times? And I recommend you look at films of him hitting, because he had a sweet swing, bad ball hitter or not. He had that classic left-hander he slashes like he's a swordsman in an old movie, an Errol Flynn film. Coming soon to a theater near you, Errol Flynn, Lawrence Peter Berra taking it to the king in Bats Under Two Flags. I'm sorry to let that go on so long, but I like the idea so much. I love a good swashbuckler, and as good as the skipper's dad, Alan Hale, was in all those Errol Flynn movies, I think Yogi would have been even better. The timing doesn't quite line up because Flynn had really burned himself out long before Yogi was a famous ball player, but still. Lawrence, we must go to the castle and rescue the princess. Okay. During those hearings, by the way, McCarthy quoted then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, or as Lily Tomlin once referred to him, Jedgar Hoover, as saying something like, there were probably 450,000 actual communists in the United States and another 150,000 Americans who were fellow travelers, defined by McCarthy as people who didn't think they were communists and weren't members, but could be duped into saying or doing things that supported communism. That is a very dangerous formulation because it meant that if you said something like, I feel like we could maybe do something better by the poor, someone could accuse you of being a communist. What if people didn't die in mines? What if we had safety? You're a commie. Indeed, during the same weeks as the Army McCarthy hearings, a different senator made a point by reading various passages to a witness, quotations about how we should do more for poor people and exploit labor less. And each time the paragraph concluded, the witness said, yep, that's the commie line, all right. And then the senator revealed that these were quotations from various 19th century popes who were, as far as they knew, following the teachings of Jesus, not Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin. The population of the United States, circa 1950, was about 150 million. If there were 600,000 communists and or fellow travelers, they comprised 0.004% of the population, scattered across a continent of approximately 3.8 million square miles. It's not anything to be afraid of. At most, you keep your eye on it, and in a free society, you do your best to outcompete it with counter-education, but you don't foment panic against a tiny minority and set brother against brother. But as Lincoln said, at least partially, you can fool some of the people all of the time, and for that fraction of the population, it always works. They're a tiny minority too, but a loud one. Yogi was a tiny minority, being only 5'7" and Italian. And that brings me to my second related point. Now, this is one I make on the show a lot, but I feel obligated to revisit it in the context of this week's news. As you know, the Supreme Court allowed the government to revoke temporary protected status for a number of Haitian refugees this week, as well as a scattering of others, primarily Syrians, but also people from Ukraine and other places. Now, these are the same Haitians who were turned into human piñatas during the last presidential election, the people who were supposedly stealing and eating pets. They have been attacked with the worst gutter racism, of which that is just one example. This is a victory 10 years in the making, Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, said on Thursday. We can finally remove these Haitian illegal migrants from the United States. They are neither migrants nor are they here illegally. There are 350,000 of them. They first came here after a 2010 earthquake, and they have stayed. Their status has been renewed several times because Haiti is such a mess that they could make a plausible argument that they'd be returned to unsafe conditions. At minimum, their conditions here now are going to be unsafe. They are going to be harassed very badly, at minimum, by the government. And some of them are going to die as a result of this ruling. And as I said, it's not just Haitians. There are 1.3 million human beings in the U.S. under temporary protective status, and the Supreme Court just allowed the president to end that program. The government will send them back to Syria and Ukraine and other places that, as I said, are clearly not safe. Some of those Haitians have been here for 16 years. They have lives here. They have children who were born here. Since this government also denies birthright citizenship as a right, no doubt their kids, who are by every reasonable definition Americans, they will be uprooted as well. This is the smallest consideration, but some of those kids, I can't say which, I can't say who, some of them, somewhere, maybe they're the grandkids, are your future shortstops and right fielders of America. I realize that unlike the Dominican Republic, with which it shares the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, that Haiti is not a baseball country. I don't think that Haiti has ever delivered a single major leaguer to baseball. And yet, Italians don't play baseball either, certainly not in Yogi Berra's day, and yet here we are talking about him, a first-generation Italian-American. Assimilation works wonders when it comes to the national pastime. So give those Haitians time, and one day you might very well see one playing at Yankee Stadium. But time now is a luxury that they do not have, and thus the rest of us who might cheer them on don't have it either. Berra was born in 1925. He came from an Italian enclave in St. Louis, Missouri that had begun to come into being less than 40 years earlier. His parents, Pietro and Paulina, had gotten here in 1909 and 1912, respectively. That is, when Yogi was born, his dad had been here about as long as the Haitians have, and his mom had been here for a shorter time than they have. There was absolutely anti-Italian prejudice back then, really anti-Catholicism. The two big differences between communities like Yogi's that survived and that of today's Haitians, which probably won't, one is that Italians are white, although sometimes people would argue that back then. And two, it just didn't happen. The focus of anti-immigration types was on closing the door so more people didn't come. There was less success in mobilizing politics so that people who were here and had been here for a generation or two at that point would be uprooted and sent home. At the moment that Yogi was born, the Klan was pushing anti-Catholic measures, but fortunately their power was broken, or they broke themselves really, before their movement could infect the whole country. The entire difference, the point where we should all be saying, there but for the grace of God go I, that we're not on the radar of these people in power, is just a matter of luck and timing. That's it. In a parallel reality that's not too many super strings away from our own, Yogi and his childhood chum Joe Garagiola, not to mention Joe freaking DiMaggio, son of an immigrant fisherman from San Francisco, would have been carted back to Italy and, instead of playing baseball, would have been drafted into Mussolini's army and fought against Americans at Anzio. For some of the racists of that day, that would have been an optimal outcome. So here's my question. Putting aside the morality of this mass deportation plan that has now been rubber-stamped by the Supreme Court, what loss is worth it to America knowing that we are going to lose something? Even if you think the majority of those 1.3 million people are somehow toxic to the well-being of the nation, something I would argue is far from proven, how many future Yogis are you willing to lose? Or just picking someone from a different field at random. Andy Warhol was just a couple of years younger than Yogi Berra and was also the son of immigrants, in his case from what is now Slovakia. His father arrived here about the same time that Yogi's did. Let's say in these deportations, we're going to lose one future Yogi and one future Warhol. And name some scientist who is also a first-generation American. That's in there too. Some great invention or cure for something. How do you measure the cost of that? I have one more quick baseball story to share with you, one which led me to yet another human story. Not that baseball stories aren't human, but this one happens to be adjacent to the baseball story, but outside of it. It begins with Lefty Grove, ends with Dorothy Thompson, in the middle come the Nazis. And I'll tell you about that right after this third and final break of the episode. Hang in there, won't you? As always, in researching our stories for this week, I came across other stories. I would never finish if I chased all of them, but I was intrigued by a reminiscence by former catcher Bob Swift. Bob had played in the American League from 1940 through 1953, then coached in the majors for the Tigers, Senators, and A's. He was also twice an interim manager for the Tigers, taking over in both cases for Chuck Dressen, who was 70 and 71 and literally dying on the job. On this occasion, Swift recalled a scary at-bat he had against the legendary Robert Moses Lefty Grove. Grove had perhaps the greatest fastball of his day, but he was just about past his day at this point This would have happened in 1940 or 41. The date was not specified. Grove was himself 40 or 41, and that fastball was a couple of arm injuries in the past, and yet he could still be intimidating. As Swift recalled it, the three hitters ahead of me slammed line drives. Just as I'm on my way to the plate, Grove charges halfway in from the mound. Peacock is the catcher, and he walks out to meet his pitcher. I've had enough of this, says Lefty, so mad he looks like he's about to blow his top. The next batter goes down on the seat of his pants. I look around and there's nobody there but me. No matter how much I want to escape, I'm still the next hitter. Grove fires a blazer at me and down I go. Did you get a hit? Swift was asked. I don't remember, he said. At that point, I was only interested in saving my life. Since I'm here to tell the story, it must be clear that I accomplished my purpose. Now, as I said, there was no date, but the number of possibilities was limited enough I thought I'd see if I could find it and figure out if he did indeed get a hit. Not that Swift got many. Lefty Grove pitching to Johnny Peacock in St. Louis. This would have been a Browns-Red Sox game. Again, could only have been 1940 or 41. Before that, Swift wasn't in the league. After that, Grove wasn't in the league. It turned out not to be that simple. Swift got in 14 at-bats against Grove over those 2 seasons, and he had 3 hits. He came up in enough situations that roughly matched the one he described. These obviously weren't the best years for Lefty Grove, that it's easier for me to say that sometimes he got a hit and sometimes he didn't. He wasn't much of a hitter in general, and his 3 for 14 against Grove isn't too different from what you'd have expected him to do in any set of circumstances. My favorite candidate for the game in question doesn't really work. On July 14th, 1940, Swift batted against Grove in the top of the 4th. After Rip Radcliffe had an infield hit, George McGuinn flied out to center. Let's guess it was a crisply hit fly. Harland Clift tripled, and Don Hefner doubled. That brought out Swift, who flew out to center. Would Grove have been aggrieved at that point? Probably. However, the game took place in Boston rather than Sportsman's Park in St. Louis, and Johnny Peacock wasn't catching Grove that day, although he did pinch hit and enter the game later after Grove had already gone to the showers. In looking for game stories that described Bob Swift being dusted off by an annoyed Lefty Grove, I came across a Dorothy Thompson column. I mentioned Thompson before on the show. She was one of the first political commentators to realize just how dangerously evil the Nazis were, and the Nazis chased her out of Germany for saying so. She thought Hitler was a mediocrity, and she was right, although that turned out not to be the point. He pathologically avoided doing anything, but his rhetoric meant that others did the devil's work for him, or were inspired by him to do it. Working towards the Führer, they called it. Do not what he told you to do, because he avoided telling people to do things. He avoided going to the office in general, but just do what you think he would want you to do. That formulation turned out to have no lower limit to it. The Second World War formally started in September 1939. By the time Bob Swift faced a torqued-off lefty, there was an international refugee crisis on, one which wouldn't be resolved until long after the war was over. One immediate problem was that the United States wouldn't take anybody. We had closed the door on immigration in the 1920s, and it was going to stay closed right through the war, even if hundreds of thousands or millions were dying. The case that has been adopted as symbolic of that was the voyage of the St. Louis, a ship which left Hamburg with over 900 mostly Jewish refugees. They first went to Cuba, and the Cubans wouldn't let them in. They then tried to sail to Florida, but Franklin Roosevelt's government used the Coast Guard to keep them away from the coast. Canada would not take them either. Blocking the St. Louis from Florida, that was actually the work of the State Department and a particular Assistant Secretary of State who seems to have had it in for the Jews and did his best to block every effort to aid them during World War II. His name was Breckinridge Long. At least he seems like the most likely suspect. Ultimately, the passengers on the St. Louis went to Britain. Some of them were admitted there. Some of them were forced to go back to Europe, at which point they were caught up in the Holocaust anyway. I say that very lightly, but if I say it with all the gravity it deserves, I don't know how to do it justice, and there's no way to. The day that the papers carried news of the Browns and Red Sox facing off in a way that might have frightened Bob Swift, Miss Thompson's column featured an open letter to Senator Key Pittman, Democrat of Nevada. To be honest, I'm not completely sure why she picked on Senator Pittman. maybe because he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She began, "My dear Senator Pittman, there are 100,000 children waiting on the besieged little island of Great Britain to be evacuated to the United States, here to stay for the duration of the war. There are many times the necessary number of homes ready to receive these children here in America. But the moving of 100,000 children from a dangerous place to a safe one seems to be beyond the competency of the world's greatest democracy." She put that in quotes. Is it really? Mr. Senator, the people of this country are anxious to do something fine, big, and generous that will register for ourselves and the world that the idea of respect for humanity, which seems almost dead on this earth, is still alive in America. Respect for humanity is what this country is all about, Mr. Senator, as you very well know. If the time ever comes when we ourselves begin to doubt whether we really feel much respect for humanity, for the simple right of human beings to live, a worse disaster will have overcome us than any we can yet foresee. Among our people, there are many reactions to this war and varying policies regarding it, but this is one thing on which we can all unite. We do not want any children to perish that we can save. Miss Thompson, you've been gone a very long time, but if you're somewhere listening, I need to tell you that a worse disaster has overcome us. That is all. You know how this episode's hero, Yogi Berra, said it ain't over till it's over? Well, this episode ain't quite over yet. Should you wish to follow me on social media, I'm flattered, and you can do so at stephengoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and there remains a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, bang, you're there. I always announce the latest episode and post pictures when there are some to share. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning, home of the dead player of the day. Gear of rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, then disrupt the podcatching industry. Start up one that allows people to do lots of things. Free the podcatchers. Then ramp up the price. That's how that always works. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, don't just demand something fine, big, and generous in the world, but be the something fine, big, and generous in the world that you want to see. Well, I think I've mastered being the big part of that, but as for fine and generous, that requires a course of self-improvement, which I will undertake next week when I return with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.